Hello there. Welcome back to another episode of ANEA on the Air, our web series bringing together advocates, organizers, and community leaders working to end the HIV epidemic. My name is Deidre Lee, and I am the director of the Act Now in AIDS Coalition. Our episode today is centered on civil disobedience. Under the current administration, we have seen a surge in collective action. That's rallies, protests, marches, and other direct actions. People all over the country are stepping into their power to demand change and justice. Today, we will discuss civil disobedience as a tool for visibility, accountability, and progress. We are joined by guests who know firsthand what it takes to organize, take risks, and move policy through the power of people. I'm going to give you the first question, and as you answer, can you please introduce yourself? And thank you so much for being here and joining us. So, how do you define civil disobedience in the context of HIV advocacy? So, any of you can start us off, and when you start, go ahead and introduce yourself.
I can kick things off. Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. I'm Kendall Martinez Wright, she, her pronouns, and I am TAG's Government Relations and Policy Associate. And the question resonates so hard with me because civil disobedience has been the forefront of a HIV advocacy from day one when the first cases was being shown, and folks were still wondering, okay, what is going on here? We need action. And they took to a step of doing various actions such as civil disobedience to gain attention to stakeholders, to those who have a whole different perspective on what was going on. So, you know, all this to say, I see it is integral in this space. It is something that um, without it, we would not be where we at today.
Thank you, Kendall. Did anyone want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll follow on. I'm Asia Russell. I'm the executive director of a global treatment activist organization and prevention activist organization called Health Gap. And I first got started as an AIDS activist by being trained and grounded in civil disobedience with activists from groups like ACT UP Philadelphia. And I think the way I conceptualize civil disobedience in the context of HIV advocacy is it's directly impacted communities stepping up and, in most cases, literally putting their bodies on the line in response to immoral and unjust policies, laws, budgets, decisions, media coverage, depictions of people with HIV in their communities, all of these things. I think the orientation, like in many social justice movements, not only ones related to HIV or public health, but related to racial justice, queer rights, fighting back against transphobia, there's a recognition that if we only ever ask to be treated with respect and treated with equality and afforded the resources that we require and demand, we will always be told no. There's a very sophisticated recognition in civil disobedience that sometimes you actually need to raise the political consequence of deliberately making a harmful decision. And it's very difficult to do that with other tactics alone. Of course, we'll get to this, but you need all the tactics. You need the white papers, you need the press conferences, you need the meetings with decision makers. But I think we all recognize, because of the structural injustices at play with the AIDS crisis in the US and globally, those kinds of tactics on their own will never, ever, and have never, ever, ever been sufficient because evidence is not enough. We know the decisions that are being made that harm our communities are being made despite the evidence. So civil disobedience is like solving that problem through additional tactics that everyone can do. I think a lot is made about how brave, how courageous, how this, how that you have to be. The reality is that kind of contribution is available to all of us. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that can look, because it looks different for different people for sure. But the core thing is civil disobedience is part of our family. It's part of our hearts and souls. And it's also tactically essential to us making any progress in defeating not just the AIDS crisis, but the structural injustices that fuel this unacceptable pandemic.
Charles?
If I can add on to that, I do a lot of training in direct action and civil disobedience, and one of the things that I always start out by doing is grounding what we've done in the AIDS movement in the predecessor to our movement, which was primarily the civil rights movement, and then followed by the anti-war and the women's rights movements. But there's this one paragraph that I always begin a training on that comes from Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail. And I'd just like to take a second to read it for you. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are exactly right to call for negotiation. Indeed, this is the purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such a creative tension that a community that has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to so dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. I just referred to the creation of tension as part of the work of the nonviolent resistor. This may sound shocking, but I must confess, I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly worked and preached against violent tension, but there is a type of constructive nonviolent tension that is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt it was necessary to create tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and have truths to unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, we must see the need for having nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help people rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. So the purpose of direct action is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation.
Thank you, Charles. And by the way, I think you forgot to introduce yourself, but that's Charles King, CEO of Housing Works. And Charles, you mentioned the civil rights movement, and you mentioned the women's rights movement. So I just wanted to ask you, toss you this next question. How has civil disobedience historically shaped HIV advocacy and policy changes, and what lessons can activists currently draw from those movements?
You know, it's interesting. I gave a presentation back in June that spoke to this. What I can tell you is, as Asia said, much of where we are now with HIV and AIDS in the United States and around the globe is because of what activists did, particularly through the various permutations of ACT UP, whether it's ACT UP New York, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Paris. They popped up all over the globe, engaging in direct action. And so when, we had a president who couldn't say the word AIDS, we carried ashes and of our loved ones who died, and through them on the lawn of the White House. Various people who I was very close to when they died of AIDS asked us to have a political funeral with their body as a way to tell the world what was really happening. Peter Staley led an effort to put a condom over Jesse Helms' house because Jesse Helms was violently opposed to any funding for condoms and other types of HIV prevention. So all the drugs that we have, all of that came because activists were willing to take that on. And when preachers, evangelical preachers, were saying that HIV was God's punishment on those sodomites, we were doing sodomy demonstrations in Atlanta, Georgia. I became involved in ACT UP in 1988, and by 1991, I had racked up over 100 arrests. So we just threw ourselves into it, and as Asia said, just kept putting our bodies on the line, and we started seeing real progress come about. And I think one of the things that we're seeing in this new second Trump term is that we've become quite complacent, and it's really time to go back to the grassroots tactics that worked for us back in the late 80s, early 90s.
Kendall or Asia, did you want to add anything about what lessons can current activists draw from these movements?
I'll just add that direct action works. And that's part of why we see it in successful movements across centuries, is because it's only when outrageous, immoral, and truly cruel bigotry gets confronted with the power that we have. We don't have the same power that they do, but we have a massive power. The power to confront, the power to show bravery, the power to obstruct, and the power to mock as well, because ultimately it's their own, vanity and ignorance that they choose in response to the justice and the minimal imperative of equity that is actually, we're bigger than they are. We have more people on our side. The issue is how to use that sort of asymmetrical and spark that asymmetrical power. And it's through direct action. We get the attention of those who influence the duty bearers, whether that's the media, whether that's cultural and religious leaders in their own communities. And we use those streams of influence over and over again. And it's true with AIDS activism, it's only because of those steps, that willingness to get arrested, to speak truth to power, to not just sit down and accept crumbs at the table, that we have the advances we have today. And those are exactly the advances that are being rapidly decimated by this administration. And it's not that we always have to do exactly the same thing, but that core truth of confronting power with the expertise, the legitimacy, and the demand that people living with HIV and their lovers and communities have, that is a winning proposition. And that's what we have to apply again.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Kendall.
Yeah, I in total agreement with both Charles and Asia. And I also want to add on, it is given that level of vulnerability, especially from the past when folks were literally moments away from their untimely demise, showing up to the steps of the NIH, showing up to the White House, and letting their voices know, like, this is not acceptable, what you are doing, administration. We are here to make a loud voice for a reason. We are here to tell y'all you need to do some damn work in terms of addressing this issue, because if not, more and more people are going to die, and this disease will ultimately be the victor. And so all together, having that sense of vulnerability, alongside with confronting, confronting what is in front of you, that is something that a lot of young folks, hell, even me, can learn from, because it is also an evolving type of deal, where now we got social media and we got various outlets that we can utilize to showcase our actions.
Thank you both for sharing that. And Asia, I know from earlier you had some more you wanted to add, so I'm going to go ahead and get to that question for you. How do you see civil disobedience fitting alongside other advocacy strategies like policy work, coalition building, or direct service?
Well, it's definitely not a binary. Like, we need the whole spectrum of tactics. I mean, I was trained in community organizing by people living with HIV in ACT Philadelphia, and there was this intense and really pragmatic recognition that you need everyone to be doing what is effective to get us toward the goal. Whether that goal is about getting antiretroviral treatment to people in jails and prisons across Pennsylvania, which was an early campaign ACT UP Philadelphia took on, because people might not remember, but in the earliest days of triple combination therapy, it was actually being rationed across the US because the drugs were so unaffordable, and because of racist and classist ideas about who could be trusted to be a good patient. So whether it was campaigns like that, where everything was required, from legislation to direct action to media engagement to incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people speaking for themselves about their priorities, to global activist movements where the demand was being made to decision makers on Capitol Hill, but was coming from halfway around the world, and where different, innovative strategies were needed. But I think what's important to remember amidst this is, a lot of the decision makers we focus on, they're people as well, and they often have very thin skin, even though they're in politics. And there's always a pushback when there's something, like a direct action intervention, like whether that's shouting someone down who has a direct role in a deadly policy to bring attention to the harms that they're causing, or whether it's an office takeover or any other tactic. And sometimes we see, members of our own movement criticizing what we're doing. And I think that's something that has no place with civil disobedience. I think we all need to talk frankly and honestly as coalitions about what our reasoning, what our orientation and understanding is. But sometimes there's this like lack of discipline or division that's so silly, because ultimately, of course, the whole point of civil disobedience is that you're bringing the harms that someone is causing, the consequence of those decisions, right to them. That is not pleasant. That is why we do it. No one likes to do it. It is necessary, because otherwise our white papers get accepted, our press conferences happen, and nothing ever changes. So I think we need each other, but sometimes we're like the ugly stepchildren or something, and it's absurd. It's like we aren't expert, or we don't come from a place of intense internal scrutiny and evaluation about the trade-offs necessary, or when it's important not to do civil disobedience or any of that. So I think the main point is there isn't supremacy of one tactic over another. The point is how they fit together to move the needle to win. And we don't have the luxury of sort of picking and choosing or criticizing one another, or the luxury of time, frankly. I mean, this administration is moving at such a breathtaking pace. We're 10 months in, and the kind of lawlessness that's harming people with HIV is really stunning. So I think that's just one one observation from my side. And sorry for the inside baseball.
If I could jump in on the inside baseball, I want to give an example of that. Back in, I think it was 1990, could have been 89, ACT UP and this organization called Women's Health Action and Mobilization, WHAM. We decided to convene this Sunday action called Stop the Church. And a number of us actually went into St. Patrick's Cathedral here in New York and disrupted the service while John Cardinal O'Connor was attempting to offer his homily. And so we did the action. About 100 of us were arrested. And even in all of the gay press, there was all of this mass condemnation of how could these AIDS activists and women's health activists disrupt a religious service. And what was interesting, what is the next wave that followed after that. And it was even organizations like the New York Times doing very long pieces that outlined our critiques of the Archdiocese of New York, which had created 2 AIDS designated centers, not because they cared about people living with HIV, but because their hospitals were going bankrupt and they wanted to make money off of the system. Yet my lover, when his partner prior to me took him to St. Vincent's Hospital, because he wasn't a legal family member, this person could not go to see him on the isolation ward where he died 2 weeks later, or the nursing home for people with HIV that the Archdiocese had set up was refusing to give people access to condoms. And all of that came out and became very public because we had done such a militant action that disrupted the system in a way that brought attention to its failings.
CD seems like it's really a divisive issue about when you do it, how you do it, maybe even why you do it. I know a lot of people draw the line on getting arrested, and that was one of the kind of divisive issues. But yeah, I'm learning a lot from all of you about some of the other ways and instances that you all have been criticized in this movement for being disobedient, which is kind of in the name of civil disobedience, right? How do your identities, whether it's race, gender, sexuality, HIV status, shape your approach to civil disobedience?
So I can kick things off. So first and foremost, as an Afro-Puerto Rican trans woman from rural Missouri who is HIV negative, I see my role and my approach to civil disobedience as something mandatory in a way, because my ancestors like Marsha P. Johnson or my Boricua mother, Sylvia Rivera, when they was marching and raising hell in regards to trans rights and just being able to exist and coincide with other members within the community and within the larger community, I see it as a must in terms of what I need to do as the current future generation that they saw. I also see it as, even though I'm HIV negative, HIV does not discriminate, and there could be there could be an instance where something can transpire and I can develop it, or have a loved one, have acquisition. And so, even so, I see it as a place of making sure that our my efforts are done in a loving way, as well as in a way where folks can folks see the true nature of how various sectors of community can come together and be in agreement of HIV being a disease that should be eradicated, and hope and ultimately become the past and not the current future.
I'll add something to that. Thank you, Kendall. I mean, from my perspective, I see it as an obligation, in part because, so I've been an AIDS activist for basically my entire adult life. I joined ACT UP Philadelphia in like 1995. And as an activist, recognize that as a white HIV negative woman, the privilege I have, or the privilege I could deploy, was actually really helpful because in so many situations, I mean, Philadelphia is a city notorious for its police violence, for its homophobia, transphobia, even to this day, but particularly then. But just to tell a little side story, like ACT UP Philadelphia, through its direct action at the time targeting George Herbert Walker Bush, before I joined in the early 90s, experienced so much intense police brutality in a downtown center city march. They actually secured a consent decree against the police that mandated that they be treated in a different way when protests took place. So this sort of like radical and deep understanding of the way, not just the civil disobedience itself, but the thing Charles was also talking about, the follow-up, how you leverage what happened that day as part of your policy goals for the campaign you were working on, but also for everything else you're trying to accomplish in society. Like that was very eye-opening. Again, it had happened before I was part of this organization and this effort. But it also informed me, about how folks who are not considered the target and are moving around a campaign or a protest with privilege can and must take on more of the risk. So that's something that's been taught to me that I try to lovingly, but pretty belligerently teach to other people. And it's just so important. It shows up whether you're doing local organizing, statewide, national, or global organizing. I lived in Uganda for 11 years during 3 presidential elections, 2 anti-homosexuality acts, and everyone was always asking, are you worried? What's going to happen to you? Honey, I am not the target, but I can do something with my power. And that kind of recognition and engagement is really liberating, and is part of what goes along with civil disobedience. And I think once you kind of unlock that a little bit and see what your role could be, you can try it out, you can experiment, and then you may actually surprise yourself in terms of what you're able and willing to do. And that final observation, you had mentioned, like the way sometimes, I'm always astonished at how radical it seems to be to get arrested, when in fact it's the experience of so many people for so many reasons. I think there's this way in which sometimes we stigmatize it within our movement, when it's not, in some ways it's not that deep. It's the least that can be done sometimes to elevate the political cost of some of these really horrific decisions. And then the final point is sort of like, there has to be some equality between the way we describe the harms of these policies and the things we're willing to do. Otherwise, it sounds like we're kind of empty, right? Like if we're just willing to yell about them, but then only issue a white paper, then are we really serious? And again, not everyone can take the risk. So then it becomes an organizing strategy. You have to find the people who are able to do that. And over again, it's, I mean, Kendall said it herself, it's the people with the most to lose who lead us. So I think that's the other obligation that really holds me accountable and has pushed me forward is, if people with so much more at stake in terms of violence, in terms of harm, are leading, then the least I can do is follow.
So if I could just briefly add to that, I'm a gay man, I'm HIV positive, I'm white, but the way I show up is that I'm a Baptist minister. And Kendall and Asia can testify, every time I do civil disobedience, I'm wearing a collar. And that's to counter this whole idea that it's somehow this radical thing. I engage in civil disobedience as a practice of my faith. And I think that's important for people to appreciate, particularly the people we are confronting. The one other thing that I just want to throw in, I meant to raise this earlier, civil disobedience does not always mean getting arrested. In fact, we have had the recent experience of doing civil disobedience in public spaces in Washington, D.C., where the Washington Metro Police have been very clear to us that unless we damage property, we can take over whatever intersection, we can do whatever disruptive we want. They are not going to arrest us. And it's kind of fun to be able to get out there and play around in the middle of the street, knowing that at the end of the day, when we're tired, we're going to get up and go home, because the police actually, if anything, they support what we're doing.
Thank you all for sharing that. I heard a lot of different reasons for why you do it. For some of you, it's your duty, it's your practice of your faith. And the question that really stood out to me is, what are you willing to do? And I think there's a lot of people who don't yet know what they're willing to do, what they have to do. It's not to that point yet for some people. But as we're thinking about kind of our identities in this current season that we're in now, a lot of the protections that used to exist don't anymore. So when you're doing civil disobedience, what risk, whether it's legal, whether it's physical, whether it's to your reputation, what do you weigh before taking action, and how do you decide that it's worth it?
I can kick things off again. The biggest one is my safety. I'm a person of color, and most times law enforcement do not see well with persons of color who are being in or acting in civil disobedience. We've seen it in the past with some of the greats like Martin Luther King, like Malcolm X, and so being brutalized, that's something I take to heart, but also I see it as almost in a kind of morbid way, a badge of honor, because even though things could go either way, I'm making a firm stance and I am showing folks that this issue is so critical for me, because one way or another, I am affected by it, whether it's indirectly or directly. And so, um, yeah, overall, the brutality of it. And I have little moments of, you know, s- fear of legal, but that can go away. It's more safety.
Thank you for sharing that, Kendall. Charles or Asia, did you want to add?
I should have saved my comments about the DC police not arresting us. For uh, look, I think one of the things that's uh, important is that as you develop expertise doing civil disobedience, you are able pretty much to anticipate what's going to happen. We know, for example, that 90 times out of 100, at least, if you get arrested in any of the Capitol buildings in Washington, D.C., you're going to have to put up a $50 bail, and then you're going to be released and the charges are going to be dropped. It's called post and forfeit. However, we also know that there are these exceptional cases where the police decide that they're going to be deliberately tough on somebody. And so and Asia had this experience. One of Housing Works employees is dealing with this right now. And so we're always prepared for the worst case. So for example, we've hired for the Housing Works employee who was charged, I think, very unfairly. We've hired a very good defense attorney. We're going to take people down to pack the courthouse when her trial begins, and doing everything we can to aggressively assert her right to do this. So I think it's about knowing what the risks are, doing a careful assessment. 90 to 10 is pretty good odds. But we also know there's that extra 10% where you might have to deal with something a little bit different. And in that case, you just have to be prepared to take it on, and also to figure out how you use that to further leverage your advocacy.
The only thing I would add is, yeah, we have to help one another be prepared, and like adequate preparation, just like for any other intervention, takes time, it takes access to information, it takes a community. So we need that anyway. So we deploy that to help people be able to be prepared. The one thing that perked my ears up is when you mentioned reputational risk. And it's so funny because, again, none of this should be stigmatized. I mean, Kendall mentioned indeed that it I don't know if it's an honor, but it should be a little bit more proximate to people as part of the language of transforming an unjust world into one that's accountable for people with HIV. So it's always interesting to me that, like, anyone who does civil disobedience as part of the litany of things they're good at, like writing policy papers, talking to the media, lobbying duty bearers, in amidst that has to be an understanding when you're sitting down in front of the chief of staff for the lawmaker. It's actually reputationally powerful for them to know that you are so deeply committed to this issue. You don't only stop at talking to them about it, you're actually willing to come back and occupy their office in defiance of the law in order to make the point real. Because what they also know as a chief of staff is that they do not actually care about this issue. It's very rare that a duty bearer, and I don't say that in a pejorative way, it's just the reality. It's very rare that duty bearers deeply care about it. It's not impossible, but oftentimes it's not the case. Probably the same odds as the odds Charles talked about. And it's, let's be honest, they're politicians. They got elected. Their sights are set on other things than the truth teller in their office. So all we're doing is turning the tables so that the power sits with us for the time that we're carrying out this campaign. And then some of my mentors taught me, it's not about actually changing their hearts and their minds. It's about them understanding that we're enough of an annoyance that they actually have to change what they're doing, because it's easier for them to do what we're asking for and take credit for it than it is for them to have to keep dealing with us and our repeated demand. And that kind of equation is not unique to AIDS activism. It's something that's part of social justice organizing, the world over. But I think it's what makes the reputational risk point so curious, because indeed, to me, it's pretty logical to engage in civil disobedience, and it should be something that's much more like integrated among the politics of the people that we collaborate with. And I think for most people in the AIDS activist movement, it sort of is. But it's just interesting. Anytime I encounter someone who's like, "Oh, that means you're some kind of like criminal," like, first of all, let's not shame people. But second of all, it's really quite interesting, because it's kind of the cop in our heads, and it's until we kind of unpack that and recognize, like, oh right, this is why you do these. It's not to get attention or because there's some thrill. It's because these systems are not going to change on their own. Like, we need to all do our part and see what the outcome is with the time that we have.
You bring up such a good point, Asia. I was just thinking about the conditioning, right? That we all had to follow the rules. And here you go, all you rule breakers who go do the thing, right? So it is kind of hard to kind of undo that conditioning, because like, oh no, I'm not supposed to do that. I'm not supposed to interrupt. I'm not supposed to, stand in the way. I'm not, so it is a bit of a unconditioning that kind of has to happen. And so I was kind of thinking about because we talked about preparation, and I know there's trainings, I know there's bail funds that happen, but also what kind of mental and physical preparation might you all go through before taking part in an action? Kendall, did you want to start? I know you was about to say something, or did you want to finish your last point?
Oh, I was about to hit on the mode of submissiveness, what they want us to be in.
You going to say more on that, Kendall?
So in terms of mental and physical preparation, mine is more mental and spiritual. I just take time just to meditate, be, to have a moment of meditation and prayer, to the Lord, and be like, hey, look, I'm doing this to protect me. Let your hands guide me also into this, because I'm not doing this alone. I got my comrades. I got, the man upstairs. I got, my ancestors, you name it. And so that's one thing I really do. And then in terms of physical preparation, I really don't do nothing. The only thing I do is I'll write down my emergency contact phone number, just in case if anything goes awry. But yeah, I just show up ready.
I think what Kendall said was, her last comment was probably the one that resonated with me. Just show up ready. Don't have too much money on you. Don't need to carry your wallet. Make sure you have current ID. Make sure you have your $50, a credit card so you can catch a cab after. And that's all you need. Just show up and be ready to get down with everybody. And one of the things I would say is that, civil disobedience is generally for us a group activity. And it could be 5 of us sitting in an office, or it could be 50 of us taking over an intersection. And the one thing in terms of preparation is making sure that, one, everybody knows exactly what the plan is. 2, everybody knows that they can opt out until the police say you're under arrest. And 3, that we work to build consensus around whatever strategies we do. And if we do that and we're all in it together, no matter what happens, we're going to end up with a successful action.
I think the only other thing to add is being ready, even during the course of the action, to speak to duty bearers and to the media who are milling around inevitably, because you'd be surprised at the openness in people's minds and hearts, actually, counter to what I just said, but it's a unique moment of communication, quite literally. And you have power while you're occupying the space, or whatever the tactic is that you're deploying, and you have something to say. It's not just vibes, it's demands, it's evidence, it's all those things. So feel free to talk. The media will come by and shove a microphone in your face, will write down what it is that you're saying, what your signs say. They're capturing what's taking place. So that's also part of being prepared, is what's your elevator pitch? What is your 30-second soundbite? And you practice it over and over again so that you don't forget it or mess it up or whatever. But that's also part of it too, using, once you've created the kind of environment of powers, really using it.
That's such a great point, Asia, because sometimes it's not even the media. Sometimes it's just people walking by and they'll be like, why are you doing this? So it is important to know the reason that you're out there, what your sign is saying, what folks are chanting, why they're saying that. That's really important. So someone who might be thinking about civil disobedience for the first time, I kind of want you all to think back to your very first time of civil disobedience and really get us into how you felt. Were you scared? Were you nervous? Did you mess up? Did you forget the chant? And what did you learn from that experience? Anyone can start.
And Asia's response to the question.
I can't even remember why I was like, did you mess up? Oh, that was the I love that question. Because that's the other thing, is these tactics are going to be needed for a little while. So part of showing up to AIDS activism is knowing that you're going to show up again and again, no matter what, whether you're going to be baking cookies for the people who got arrested, or getting arrested yourself, or doing the media outreach, or helping, with what we call jail support, any of that stuff. The one thing we can count on is knowing that it's going to need to be more than once. So even if we mess up, it's you got a chance for a do-over. That's the plus side of this system of injustice that we're kind of railing against. So I was just thinking about the first time I was part of a nonviolent civil disobedience, and it was actually during the first Iraq War. I guess I was 15 or 14, and I had taken off school that day. Like many people my age, it was one of the first times, we'd heard about unjust wars from other people in our lives, but seeing what the administration was doing and sort of what the stakes were was really eye-opening to so many of us. In any case, I went to a protest in front of the White House with some comrades and didn't intend to get arrested. We intended to participate. But then it became really clear that the police wanted to clear us out from the space that we were in. And that didn't make any sense to me at all. I really believed and felt the things that I was saying and chanting that day, and the reason that I had gotten out of bed and done what I was doing. And it felt very integrating to be part of a group of young people. We ended up being about 25 people who were among the many getting arrested that day. And we were all separated aside because we were like juveniles, and I didn't know what my family was going to think, what was going to happen, whether I was going to be okay in terms of like who was going to pick me up. Like I wasn't prepared, actually. I don't know that I had my ID that day, because I needed to do it. I was very called, not in an esoteric way, but in a very grounded way. That was what I had to do. It was the logical extension of the belief that I felt. So that felt really good, actually. And it's been downhill from there. But you could say, in a way, like according to the rules of civil disobedience, I kind of messed up because I didn't have jail support. I didn't have someone coordinating, calling my people. My parents were at work. They couldn't just drop what they were doing and come and pick me up or any, like none of that was there. But I didn't mess up because I followed my brain and my heart, and built up my own system of integrity and accountability that day. I learned something about myself, and I learned something about my community as well.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. What did your parents say when they found out you had gotten arrested?
They were very proud.
Oh,
Parents,
wow.
yeah, they were extremely proud. And that's a longer story, maybe over drinks. But yeah, my grandmother was an Irish Catholic, was living with us, at the time, to avoid having to be in a nursing home. And she answered the phone when the cops called, and she said, "Oh, Asia would never do that. She's too nice." But she was also extremely proud.
Yeah, what a story. Kendall, Charles, do you all have anything you want to share?
So my first arrest, I was actually I was in Yale Divinity School. I was leading I was counselor to a group of undergraduates who wanted to do direct action to protest the reinstatement of the draft. This was in the early 80s. And we decided that we were going to basically lock the main doors of the post office. That was the one federal building in town, by chaining ourselves together and through the double doors. We did that. We didn't really appreciate that there was a side entrance to the post office, and they opened that up. We hung out there chanting and protesting all afternoon. Unbeknownst to us, the mayor, I guess out of support for us, had ordered the police not to arrest us. And so the post office closed. And ultimately, we had to ask somebody to go get some chain cutters to cut ourselves loose, because we were completely unprepared for this outcome, and walked ourselves across the New Haven Green very dispirited because we hadn't been arrested. And it took me a while to appreciate that getting arrested wasn't the point. We'd made our statement. We got the publicity from our statement. And hey, guess what? We didn't have to go to jail. So now when the Metro Police say, we're not going to arrest you, I'm like, hooray, let's do something bigger.
Awesome. Thank you, Charles. Kendall, do you have a story?
Yeah, so my first civil disobedience protest was actually back in 2014, during Ferguson. I was actually at Ferguson at the time of, the whole incident. And I remember, so I had on a gas mask and goggles, and it was kind of comical because I had these flip-flops on, which is a huge faux pas, and I was wearing shorts and a t-shirt as well. And so when things got a little heated, I was like, oh, shoot, why am I dressed like this? And then one of my dearest friends, she, a former state senator uh, at the time, she was like, now, Kendall, you should have worn pants, a long sleeve shirt, boots, or gym shoes. And so, but I learned real quickly, like, you know, at moments like that, really think true to how to prepare. So then you are not, ill fitted. And also, just be ready for whatever comes at your way because, it could be like Charles's instance where, nobody gets arrested and needing to get chain cutters so then you can be freed up. Or, having a situation where it's not too good. Yeah, that was the one biggest thing that I learned. And then second thing is not being shy, because deep down when it comes to any type of civic action, sometimes I can get a little shy. But once I warm up, it's on and popping.
Awesome, Kendall. I love that. So for the last two questions, for someone who wants to get involved but doesn't know where to start, is there any advice you would give? Next one.
I made an offer at INMEC's Biomedical Prevention Conference to all of the conferees, and I will repeat that offer for this webinar. If there's someone out there who's interested in doing civil disobedience and doesn't know where to begin, we're happy to provide folk with training. And if it's HIV related, Housing Works is committed that we will send staff to be there to provide folk with support. And if I'm available, I'll be happy to show up and go to jail with you. I'll use this to announce, we are planning a large action on World AIDS Day at the U.S. Capitol. I won't go into the detail of it, but we are planning this large action, and INMAC and AIDS United have agreed to issue a call with us in support of this action. And so one of the things we'll be doing over the next 6 to 8 weeks is a series of webinars to train people in not just this particular action, but in civil disobedience generally. So people should look for that, sign up for it, and otherwise feel free to reach out to me, king@housingworks.org, and I'll be happy to hook you up to our advocacy staff for training.
That's the plus side of the moment that we're living in, is there are so many ways you can find out how you fit in, because you're needed. Your expertise, your brilliance, your analysis, all of that can be dialed into a range of different actions. So come join us on World AIDS Day. We need you. We all want to be part of breaking through this incredibly cruel attack on people with HIV. And the good news is you can be. Yeah, just dive in. And, we never force people to do things they don't want to do. So that's the other element, is you can really ask yourself, how do I see myself in this movement? And then dive in and try it out. And we don't have all the answers. I think that's the sort of final observation. Charles mentioned this is like a group activity. That's the other component, is no one pretends to know the right way to do any of this stuff. I've been in so many meetings where the person who thought that they were so new and inexperienced and had nothing to share was the one who had the connection or had the new, visual kind of pitch about what we should be doing versus like the old tired thing. And if that person hadn't shown up and brought that analysis into the room, we wouldn't have been as powerful. So it's a very unique kind of organizing space that's dynamic, that's vibrant, that's somewhat flat in terms of expertise and accountability. And I think that's also really refreshing, particularly to a lot of young people who are just fed up with like hierarchical spaces where dinosaurs like me are thought of as like, you know, where things just feel really boring, frankly. This is not a boring space. It's very dynamic. We're trying to do really, really big, important things. And we don't have the answers about how we're going to win, but we are committed to winning. And it's such a privilege to be a part of movements that feel obligated to win. And that's the heart and soul of AIDS activism.
Yeah, pretty much +1 to both Asia and Charles's point. I will also add, as mentioned earlier, social media nowadays is, a plethora. And so there is moments where you can search up, hey, is there any, type of marches or, something like that. And 9 times out of 10, something is going to come up. And so that's another way to plug in, as well as, if you're not on social media for whatever reason, just being in community, and just just have a simple inquiry of, hey, I want to be, more involved. What can I do? And if there's nothing going on, maybe you could be taking the lead, in terms of, doing some type of action, whether it's you risking arrest or just, standing at intersection with signs and chanting. So yeah, there's different ways to get engaged. And this movement altogether is, a spectrum of ways to, show up to address issues that is true and near to your hearts.
Thank you. So for our last question, when you think about future generations of HIV advocates, what role do you hope civil disobedience will play? And anyone can start.
So I'll kick this last question off. I am, I'm hopeful that, the future generations, and even the generations that's coming up, they realize the magnitude of how impactful, these civil disobediences have held. It is a generational type of deal. And, sometimes it can get overshadowed by the progress. But, ultimately, even though there is progress, we still have to remember the past and remember that we would not be where we are at if it wasn't for people being courageous, putting their lives on the line to raise up their voices and say, enough is enough. Now's the time to put in action to words, not words to action. And so ultimately, hopefully, the future generation, if HIV is still, prevalent, because there's no known of whether or not HIV will be prevalent or not. We could be in a space where HIV is potentially the past. And so making sure that they are knowledgeable to where they can say, you know what, because of the past, I'm going to make a difference in the future. So then we can continue this circle of progress one way or another.
I would just briefly add to that I hope that it's seen in a much more pragmatic way and with a lot less sort of stigma and shade than I think we were talking about earlier within our community. I think there are lots and lots of social justice movements around the world, in particular outside the U.S., where there's much more of a like a sort of a critical analysis that shows how necessary it is for movements to include direct action. And for whatever reason, there's just a lot more, hesitation or hand wringing about it sometimes among AIDS activism or within AIDS activism. And so, yeah, my hope is that we're really contributing to movements that overlap and reinforce our movement with the kind of tactics that we're engaging in, and that it's just seen in a much more evidence-based light. Because, I mean, we believe in science and evidence and data, and the data show pretty comprehensively that tactics that include civil disobedience are routinely associated with more effective results at the end of a campaign versus, I mean, depending on what you're demanding for, versus, either picking a campaign that's sort of so easy to get to, you never even need it, or one where you're actually sort of disrespecting that kind of engagement because maybe you see yourself as ingratiating yourself with decision makers. And that's a way, like you sort of punch down as a way to try to advance what it is you're trying to achieve. And, at the end of the day, we're fighting for pretty bold and ambitious outcomes, or we should be. So I guess that's what I'd like to see is many, many more people building up their power and their expertise and their experience and their familiarity with civil disobedience, direct action, and the whole range of tactics that we need to engage in.
I want to say that I'm actually quite optimistic about younger people, whether it's now or down the road. This last year, Secretary of State Rubio put a hold on PEPFAR funding, and in Haiti, where we have an office, people did not have access to their medication. I talked with my staff about organizing a demonstration outside the Prime Minister's office to demand that the government provide medication. And, they were like, oh, nobody's going to want to do that. It turned out this was just before the International Day Against Homophobia, and we had an event, and there were about young LGBTQ people who came to that event. I made the pitch to them, our country director made the pitch to them, and that next Monday, about 35 of those young people showed up. We demonstrated for about an hour. Lots of military showed up, but they just observed us. We went away, and 2 days later, we got a call from the Prime Minister's office asking for a meeting. And the government pledged the funding to purchase ARVs for people. So it was a good example of older folk thinking, oh, those young people, they're not going to be up for this. And sure enough, they were not only up for it, but they did the job. They got it done.
Wow. Thank you so much to all of our speakers today for sharing your expertise. and your experiences with this. It was so great to hear all of your stories. And so as we close, I'll just leave everyone with the question that has kind of been left with me that Asia kind of brought up earlier. When we think of civil disobedience, you know, the question that we all should have is, what are we willing to do? How far are we willing to go to protect ourselves and our loved ones, and also just to challenge injustice? So thank you so much for joining us. Until next time.